Thank you to the Patreon members for supporting the channel. And just like that, the dam was gone. Within seconds, the water from the reservoir came pouring out on the Folktails. A massive wave came sweeping through the settlement, soaking their land and flooding their buildings. The Folktails watched helplessly as the water rolled in, creating a giant beaver bath. But this bath was going to do worse than just clean behind their beaver ears. The water ruined their crops so the beavers couldn't work their farms, and flooded their huts and homes so the beavers couldn't work their jobs. Minutes later, the whole ground floor of the settlement was ankle deep in water, and the reservoir wasn't even emptied yet. Their massive reserve, which was such a monumental accomplishment, had now totally flooded their home. The Iron Teeth had hit back and hit back hard. This amount of flooding was a crippling blow to the Folktails. The upper levels of the settlement were still dry and operational, including the new industrial zone, but the beavers were literally swimming on the ground level. Thankfully, no one was hurt or swept away in the flood, but the beavers were now in quite the pickle. Too much water had never been the problem before now, and the beavers weren't quite sure how to fix this. But if they didn't fix it, their whole settlement was done for. Not to mention they would have to admit defeat to the Iron Teeth. And that was never going to happen. Meanwhile, the Iron Teeth were ecstatic about their hugely successful raid. They felt strongly that they had avenged the death of Ridgemayar and put the Folktails in their place. And they went back to work the next morning with newfound joy. Joy like a mama beaver holding her newborn kit. Except that the Iron Teeth didn't even really know what that felt like because they used these disgusting breeding pods. Gross. Also, it was still the dry season, so none of their industry was running because the river wasn't turning their water wheels. But still, they had totally flooded the Folktails and ruined their day, and that brought them joy. And amidst the celebration, the Iron Teeth felt like they finally had a chance to mourn the loss of their leader Ridgemayar and honor his memory. Ridgemayar, who had led their colony in strength since the death of Quiggamit, who had stood up to the treacherous Folktails. They hoped Ridgemayar would have been proud of how they had avenged him. The Iron Teeth's raid had definitely done some damage to the Folktails colony. The beavers were soaked from the moment they woke up. All beavers enjoyed getting their fur wet, but this was just too much. And wet fur was the least of the problems this flood was causing, because half the Folktail buildings were completely inoperable. The few industries unaffected were the grills and bakeries, the scientist huts, and the windmill industrial sector, which conveniently included the explosives factory. But also their crops were drowned and dead, and their trees weren't far behind. The only farm that wasn't flooded was the new tree farm on the hill, though ironically half those trees were now dying from lack of water. So not only was half the colony suddenly unemployed, they weren't bringing in any new food or water. Luckily, they had built up quite a decent stockpile of both, enough to keep the family alive while they waited for the floodwaters to evaporate, which didn't sound like much of a plan, but so far it was the only one the Folktails had. Ration the supplies, pray to whatever spirit might make the evaporation happen faster, and maybe, just maybe, plot revenge on the Iron Teeth for what they had done. Now that the dust had settled, it was time for the Iron Teeth to decide on a new leader. The beaver Rozzy put himself forward, but unlike last time, another beaver challenged him, a hauler named Malik. So now the Iron Teeth had to come up with a trial that would determine who their next leader would be. And by the next day, their plan was ready. The two challengers would race, both on foot and through water, and the winner of the race would be named leader of the family. The beavers chose a starting line and endpoint, and Rozzy and Malik agreed to the terms. And when the horn blew, the competitors were off in a flash. Rozzy had taken an early lead, but could he keep it? Malik was young and hungry. This was anyone's race. They dove into the water, Malik right behind Rozzy. The Iron Teeth would accept the results of the trial, whatever the outcome, but truthfully everyone wanted Rozzy to win. And as they rounded the last turn, Rozzy arrived at the finish line first. Rozzy was declared the new leader of the colony, and Malik was shamed for his failure. The Iron Teeth were excited to move forward under Rozzy's leadership. Meanwhile, the Folktails had wet feet from the moment they woke up, and that was not something to be excited about. But more importantly, they had discovered one more problem caused by the flooding. A number of their houses were now uninhabitable, leaving some beavers without a bed to sleep in. And with everything else these beavers had been through, that was simply unacceptable. So Venjo began plotting a new housing section up the hill. It was a big undertaking, but Venjo wasn't going to leave his family sleeping outdoors in a giant puddle. And seeing as nobody had any ideas to get rid of the water, new construction on dry ground was the only option. Of course, the beavers also needed to start repairing the dam, and there were plenty of unemployed beavers at the moment, so Venjo prioritized a new builder hut that would get the builder brigade back to full strength and get to work on these new houses. and the Iron Teeth were also getting to work on some new housing. These new barracks were even larger, and unlike the Folktails, the Iron Teeth had a full builder brigade ready to roll in and get to work. And their farms were doing well, and everyone was staying fed, and the metal scavenging was going well, and they had a big stockpile. But it was still the dry season, which meant their industry section was completely shut down. The water would return soon, so it didn't really matter, but the Beavers started thinking about how they might prevent that dry season slowdown. Not only did they have to wait through the droughts, but because of how many dams they had built, when the water did come back, it took an entire day before the river would get the wheels turning again. And the Iron Teeth wondered if there wasn't some alternative solution that would keep their industry running more consistently. So they started with some dynamite, which is a very good place to start. And after a bit of building and a couple of booms, the Beavers had kinda maybe an idea for moving forward. Unfortunately, they also had a lot of beavers injuring themselves on the job, so their construction plans got slightly derailed. But they had plenty of time before the next dry season. Benjo had an idea. He had found a spot where another water pump could go, on dry ground and able to function normally. But this pump wasn't about providing drinking water for the beavers. This pump was an attempt to drain the flood water faster. They weren't sure it would work, but it's not like it could make it worse. And by the end of the day, they had a water pump going, aiding the evaporation process. It was still going to be a long road, though. The builders were making progress on the new housing district, so even if the pump didn't help, the beavers wouldn't be sleeping outside anymore. And whether the flooding cleared up or not, the dry season would be over soon, and even more water would be heading their way. So the Folktails really needed to get busy rebuilding the dam. And since the explosives factory wasn't one of the buildings that got flooded, they had the tools they needed to rebuild it even better, and the tools they needed to get back at the Iron Teeth. And it was high time they got back at the Iron Teeth. While the Iron Teeth slept, the Folktails delivered their surprise. A crap ton of explosives, laid out in a chain that would completely cut off the barracks from the rest of the settlement. The Iron Teeth were startled from sleep by the thunderous sound of dynamite ripping apart the landscape, and water pouring through the channel that now separated them from everything they had built. But in their hurry to devastate the Iron Teeth, the Folktails missed an important detail, because the Iron Teeth had already pathed across the river and had a long way around back to their settlement. So the new channel was a nuisance, but definitely not the devastating blow the Folktails hoped it would be. But there was an unexpected outcome from the raid, because water began flowing through the channel, turning what was cracked and dry ground into green, usable land. So, the Beavers decided to build a dam at the end of the channel and build platforms over the rest of it, but keep the water flowing underneath. That way it wouldn't drain the river, but it would keep the land green. So it would take some construction, but the Iron Teeth were going to come out of this even better off than they were before. Speaking of coming out better than before, the reconstruction of the floodgate dam was underway. And wouldn't you know, but all of a sudden, the land finally dried up. At last, the floodwaters had receded, and the land was usable again. The Beavers had survived, and things could get back to normal. What a rough few days. And thank goodness the Folktails had such a stockpile of food and water to see them through it. That night, the Beavers gave thanks like they hadn't in a long time. The Folktails had overcome their biggest challenge yet. Of course, now was not the time to slow down. The Beavers had chewed through much of their food supply and needed to replant their farms quickly, and the dry season was nearly over. It was now imperative that the Folktails rebuild the dam, or risk the river flooding them again. And that was the last thing these Beavers wanted. So the Builder Brigade put everything they had into the reconstruction, and as the water returned, the builders were wrapping up the retaining wall and beginning on the floodgates. So they didn't get the whole dam finished in time, but the retaining wall should be enough for now. And with so many Beavers in the brigade, the floodgates would be up in no time, which would refill their reservoir and prevent any flooding. What a hustle by the Folktails. The Iron Teeth were working on covering their new canal, but even with the dam in place, they had a water flow problem. So even though they were cleaning up their paths, the riverbank was still a mess. The Beavers would need to use some more dynamite to solve this problem. They might need more dynamite to solve their Folktails problem too, but that would have to wait as they had other matters to attend to. Because the Folktails raid inadvertently opened up a whole world of possibilities. First, they had to channel this water by extending the channel further, so it flowed back into the river. But if the Beavers could harness the flow of water, that would be a game changer. The Folktails had watered their ground accidentally. The Iron Teeth wondered if they could do it again, intentionally. Dig their own channel to irrigate the land. That's pretty advanced stuff for Beavers. But first, the Iron Teeth wanted to address and solve another problem. Industry was important to the Iron Teeth, and they wanted to keep their factories going even during the droughts. but they had run out of space, so they had to get creative with expanding their power network. They built platforms so they could run their power line over the path, and then had space to build new engines. These engines would burn logs to produce power even when the water was not flowing, so their industries could remain operational. This was another big advancement for the Iron Teeth, and their settlement was really coming along. The Folktails Builder Brigade was still hustling to finish the floodgate dam, and already the river was beginning to back up because of the restricted flow. And epic build montage. The floodgates were done, all in a day's work. And then all of a sudden the river started flooding again. Inconceivable! Finish the floodgates and it starts flooding? That doesn't make any sense. Was the river spirit trying to give these beavers PTSD? They just got their lands back. Luckily, this flood sorted itself out overnight. But then the next morning, wouldn't you know it, but it flooded again. The floodgates were supposed to prevent flooding. What the heck was going on? The Builder Brigade still had to finish the inside retaining wall, so maybe that would solve the problem. Nope. For some reason, the Folktails just couldn't escape the flooding. All they had wanted was for the ground under their feet to stay dry. But apparently that was too much to ask. They had this new and improved dam, which looked awesome by the way. You'd think that would be problem solved. But you would think wrong, because the floods kept coming. No flooding at the Iron Teeth settlement, of course, but they had finished the first engine, and once they loaded it with logs, it came roaring to life, adding its power to the network. The Beavers had found their solution to the dry season slowdown, so now they could focus their attention on digging another irrigation channel. They laid out a long chain of dynamite, just like the Folktails had done, so they could bring water to what was now dry ground. And once the explosives were set, they set them off and watched the fireworks. Watched the water flow in and the green land appear. And just like that, the Iron Teeth had worked out their own irrigation system. All that was left was to cover the channel and turn it back into a road. Those clever Iron Teeth were sure making some big advances. At this point, they weren't even mad at the Folktails anymore. Not that everything was suddenly good between them or anything, just that these beavers weren't itching to get revenge, because they were growing more stable by the day. And at this point, they thought nothing would be able to bring them down. But they thought wrong. The Folktails were building a bridge across their new dam, and still dealing with intermittent flooding. They even tried excavating the riverbank in an attempt to increase the size of the basin at the bottom of the dam. But the river was still not happy with them for some reason. Maybe if they just focused on something else for a while. So they expanded their housing, they experimented with new suspension bridges, which could span gaps without needing support underneath. That could be a game changer for beavers living in a canyon. They also tried out a new kind of storage pile that was underground. Unconventional, but it could store a ton more logs. And wouldn't you know, but the river hadn't flooded in a couple days. Maybe the river spirit was just tired of the attention. The beavers were quite proud of their new housing district, but wanted to improve the landscaping. And a water pump out back would be a real improvement. A few logs later, and the pump was up and running. A beaver named Katanja took the position, and once haulers delivered the water, the whole area came alive. First the dam, now an artificial lake. The Folktails were proving themselves to be irrigation masters as well. They knew a drought was coming any day now, but with the floodgate dam completed and working, and the reservoir all filled up, the Folktails expected this dry season to be a breeze. And they were absolutely not expecting what was headed their way. Because rather than a drought, something bad was coming downriver toward the Folktails settlement. A red tide was flowing into the region, polluting the reservoir. This nasty and toxic sludge was totally taking over and having an immediate and terrible effect on the land and plants. As the bad tide reached the dam, the beavers realized they may have a big problem on their paws. And to add insult to injury, the river was flooding again. But this time flooding a mixture of water and the toxic tide. The river was turning as the bad water continued to flow, and the stream that had brought life to the colony was now poisoning it and killing it. In just a day's time, the river was turned red, and the plants were all dead. This was a problem. It was also a problem for the Iron Teeth, as the bad tide came rushing into their colony as well, poisoning their water and their land, and killing everything it touched. It didn't help that the Iron Teeth had just built irrigation channels through the interior of their settlement, speeding up the spread of the toxic sludge. It was just hours before every drop of water had turned red, except for the water in storage. Oh, and it started flooding too. The Iron Teeth were getting a taste of what the Folktails had been dealing with. Just a lot worse because this flood was poison. And by the time the flooding subsided, it didn't matter because everything was already ruined, and the Beavers were in a pickle. Will this bad tide end? And how long before it does? If it does, what will the Beavers be able to recover? And how long will that take? And was it worth the risk to wait and see? The Folktails were wrestling with the same questions. This wasn't just a drought, this was a new danger. Not only were they unprepared, they didn't even know if it was possible to prepare, or if their colony could even survive in these conditions. They had built so much here, but this settlement could be doomed. They just didn't know. They couldn't know. So that night, when the Beavers gathered, Venjo made a crucial decision for the family. The Beavers would have to leave their home or risk extinction. They gathered the family together, and together set out to find a new, and hopefully safer, land. The Iron Teeth had come to the same conclusion. This land may never recover, so the family gathered and embarked on an exodus to find a new home, away from the bad tide. Hey everyone, Lieutenant Dan here. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Beaver Tales. I am so excited to be continuing this series in Update 5. As you can see, both these beaver families are in need of a restart, and I'm excited to show you what's next. If you're enjoying these videos, I would love to hear from you in the comments, and thanks again to the Patreon members for their support of the channel. You guys have a fantastic day.